Welcome back F11s to part 2 of the fundamentals of post-production video tutorials for issue 52. In part 1 we looked at a Paris shoot and how much information I could pull out of the shadows. I'm going to continue with another image from Paris and optimize this. But this time I'm going to steer well clear of Lightroom. I'm going to do it all in Photoshop. And this is in response to a request by F11 member Maria Downey in Texas, who sent me a message saying she prefers to work solely in Photoshop and she was fascinated by what I did with the shot last month of the Burmese nun using the adjustment brush and grad tool in Lightroom, and was asking how could she achieve the same sort of thing but working solely in Lightroom. So what we're going to do is take this image of Paris, and I've shot this to hold on really to as much detail as I can in the sky, which has had the effect of the foreground of this gentleman walking across the Pont des Arts appearing much too dark and dingy and flat and boring. What I'm doing in essence is testing the 1DX Mark II to see just what I can pull out of the shadows and what I can get away with. So this is a voyage of discovery for me really as well. So in Adobe Camera Raw, I've opened the raw file and now I'm going to apply some adjustments. But let's just summarize how I'm going to approach this particular problem. I want more detail, more contrast in the lower portion of the frame here, and yet I want more detail and more punch and more impact in the sky as well. So what I'm going to do here is make two different versions of this same image working from the same raw file and merge them subsequently in Photoshop. There are many ways of doing this, many ways to skin a cat using both Lightroom and Photoshop, but this is the way that I would approach this particular problem. So the first thing I'm going to do is, if I now look at my histogram, I can see I've got a good range of tones there. But if I click on this box there, that icon on at the top of the histogram, that's going to tell me as I make adjustments just what I'm starting to lose in terms of highlights and shadows. So if I now take the white slider and move it across to the right, if I go too far, the red tells me where I'm clipping my highlights. But actually what I'm doing here is actually making the first of two versions of this image, one optimized for the bottom of the image and one for the top, i.e. the sky. So at the moment, I'm not really concerned with that clipping that's going on in the top of the image. So I'm going to go all the way to about there, which has the effect of brightening the image somewhat. I'm going to move the black slider just to the left a touch until I start to see clipping taking place. And in fact, you can see it as blue there. If I go too far, I clip shadows, and in fact I can see a little bit of blue in our subject's rucksack. So I'm going to leave the black slider well alone, and I'm going to boost the shadows here now as well quite a bit to give me some fair bit of detail there. I'm now going to go to the tone curve here, and I'm just going to boost the brightness of the image just a touch there by moving the tone curve up to the left. Okay, now I go back to my basics and I'm going to add a touch of vibrance to the image. Again, exactly the same controls as we have in Lightroom, but just with a different interface. And I'm now going to save that image as a version to be opened up subsequently in Photoshop. So if I go save image and I'm asking it to give it a name of Paris, I've chosen a selected folder called processed images, and I'm going to ask it to open it up as a TIFF, and there's a 16-bit TIFF there in Photoshop. So let's go to that, save. And it's saving that. And now I'm going to come back to my raw, come back to my tone curve, pull that back to where we started again, go back to my basics, take my whites back down, and take the shadow recovery off. And now I'm going to pull my highlights back a bit and go back to my tone curve and darken the whole picture down by pulling the curve down to the right to about that, which has given me a nice sky there. And again, I'm going to go to the save image and do exactly the same thing again. So I'm going to see you back here in just a second after a short pause with both these versions opened up in Photoshop next to each other to continue working on them. So what I have here is my two images side by side in Photoshop next to each other, the bright one and the dark one. And I'm now going to merge them together to achieve the picture I want. So numerous ways to do this, but the method I choose is by selecting this image here, and if I go and select all of the image, and now Command and X, cut that image there, and now Command, select the brighter one, Command and V. I've dropped the darker image on top of the lighter image there. I'm now going to go close that down. I don't need to save it. And what I have, if I bring my layers palette in, is the darker image as a layer on top of the brighter image. So what I'm going to do now is by using make a selection, and various ways of doing this. Again, what I often do is by actually using the lasso tool, but this time I'm going to do something. It's time for doing things differently, and I'm going to use the the quick selection tool. So if I now move the quick selection tool around here, I want to essentially select the sky, and it's done a pretty good job of selecting that sky. Of course, I'm not going to make this have the sky have a really hard edge. I'm now going to feather that selection. So I want to go up here to select and modify and feather, and give that selection a feather radius of about, well, let's say 150 pixels, okay? Make for a soft edge there. What I want to do now is actually make a layer mask. So if I go layer here, layer mask, and ask it to reveal the selection, what I have is the layer on top, the dark layer. I can only see the bit that I've selected, i.e. the sky, while beneath I can see the selection of the bridge, the brighter part that I want to as well. And immediately that's done a pretty good job of merging the images together. If I want to, if I tick that eye on and off, I can see where the mask is being applied. And if I want to, for example, just brighten down some of this area of the sky where the feathering is taking place, I can now select the mask there, go to my paintbrush tool here, adjust the size of my brush using the square brackets on the keys, and adjust my opacity. I always go for a fairly light one and build up the density. So opacity is right down at 10% or so there. And I'm now just gonna, now what I want to do is paint in white to add to that, to chip away at the mask so I can see more of the darker area on top. So if I look here, I've got white on top of black. I want to paint in white. If I hit the X button on my keyboard that changes it to black. That's how you change between the two, but actually white is right for me. So I'm just going to paint in a bit here on this sky, very subtly darken down that transition just a touch. And that is in essence how I would achieve that merge. We could have used Lightroom, we could have used the adjustment brush. Essentially what we're doing is the same thing. I hope that's been useful for those of you who prefer to work in Lightroom. This way of making two versions from the same raw image and then combining them subsequently is, for me, one of my favorite ways of working. It has so much flexibility. For example, I can now take the background bit of the image, and if I come up to here, images, adjustments and curves, and I bring my curves palette in here, I can now, if I choose to, add, brighten or darken my foreground and put contrast in as well. So what I'm going to do is just put the merest hint of an S shape into that curve there. If I preview that on and off, can you see how it adds a touch of contrast to the bottom, to the image, but only the bit that I want it to, only my foreground there. Okay, click on that, and now if I come to the top layer and do the same, image, adjustments, curves, and now what I want to do is just darken down the sky a touch. So if I take my curves and pull them down to the right, you can see I am darkening the sky. I don't want to make it look too heavy, but just as always, subtlety is key. Just a touch there really helps. And there we have it. I'm happy with that picture. It was just the second frame I exposed in Paris, and I think it's worked well. Amazing, isn't it, what can be balanced just from the one exposure? It does make me think that the use of filters is becoming less and less common. We can rely on the detail that the camera is capable of capturing and then bringing it all out using these post-production techniques. So Maria and all F11 members, I hope that was of help. Please, as Maria did, send me your suggestions for what you would like to see in these fundamentals of post-production video tutorials. I hope to hear from you soon. Keep exposing.